Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Emily, you know that saying that there's no such thing as bad publicity?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of bullshit. And I really wanted to bring it up because there have been a whole host of articles, it feels like, over the last last 6 weeks that have really painted our industry in a poor light and are getting a fair amount of airtime. Have you seen these headlines?
Yeah, and I try to force myself to read them or to listen or watch the clips around it, even though it just, I can definitely feel my blood pressure rising as I do so.
Yeah, I frankly struggle to read past the headline because, I had the same reaction. I just get really frustrated with how these things are positioned. But I want to talk a bit about it today and kind of talk about, what these articles are, kind of my takeaway on potential impact for the business here. First article that, I noticed, there have been these, I think as long as cannabis has been around, people have probably been writing like this, but just with the recent wave, certainly warrants some attention. And one that came to the forefront was from the New York Times and an article titled "Psychosis, Addiction, Chronic Vomiting as Weed Becomes More Potent, Teens Are Getting Sick." Talks a lot about the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. I think I'm pronouncing that somewhat correctly, which is a thing, certainly, that exists and certainly people have it. But I think this article, like many articles of its kind, are kind of inflationary, right? Really hype it up to be this terrible thing. And the takeaway is that the sky is falling, right? Like legal cannabis in California is causing everyone to vomit uncontrollably. And it has to do with high THC products, which is a pretty funny visual, certainly. It's a really disappointing article, and we can sit here and talk about all the terrible things, but so much of it, is just in the positioning and in language. Like there was a sentence that I pulled out here that is just so frustrating. And marijuana is not as dangerous a drug as fentanyl, but it can have potentially harmful effects. It's like right out of the gate, it's like, we got to put this in the same camp, but we're going to say it's not as bad, right? It's not as bad as the worst thing possible, but it's pretty bad, right? Is kind of their takeaway. And you can do that with anything, right? Like anything bad, like sugar is not as dangerous as fentanyl, like true statement, right? Cannabis, same thing, true statement. But when you put them together like that, it just seems like really poor taste and really inflationary and really trying to get a rise. And I think it did, the stuff gets circulated. That's not, the end of it. Obviously, in the US, we have a problem with gun control. And we've had, tons of terrible shootings recently. And Fox News and a few of their hosts, like Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson, have really been saying, don't look over here. Guns aren't the problem. It's high potency cannabis that's the problem, which is even worse than, this New York Times article, where it's really conflating, two different things and trying to, create this link together. It's really unfortunate. And I was thinking about it because I think about it, from our perspective. Obviously, we see these things and probably our listeners that are in the industry that are around it see these things and kind of just roll our eyes and like, okay, yeah, this is just crazy talk. And like, who would ever believe this? But I think people believe it. And I think that's the problem. I think that there are a whole host of people that are sitting watching Fox News that aren't cannabis consumers that have seen legalization and have seen that, the sky hasn't completely fallen on us here in their states where they're at. Maybe it's not so bad. And then they hear something like this and, for sure they're going to vote against it should it come up, right? Because who wants more mass shootings if cannabis is the culprit here? Or who wants uncontrollable vomiting in California if cannabis is the culprit here? Just wanted to talk about this because, as much as I can dismiss these and probably many others dismiss these and, we post about it, like this is ridiculous on social media. We're like kind of preaching to the choir, right? But the big question is like everybody else that's hearing this stuff and, what are they thinking?
Yeah, I think it goes to show too that the quality of journalism is hyper specific. And the fact that you just raised it, I think so well, the pairing of cannabis in the same sentence as the word fentanyl, which is something that is very fear driving in our society, because we all know that people are running into fentanyl. It's highly addictive, but also can kill you. It's like a hair trigger thing that can shut down and suppress your respiratory and cardiovascular system in a second. And it's very hard to be saved from that. Whereas cannabis quite actually doesn't do that because it doesn't interact with the brainstem. Anyway, that's a whole sidebar. And the same thing can be said for something around violence, which it's frustrating too, because I feel like we as an industry try to stay in our lane in terms of focusing on our core issues and not getting too much into the weeds on other issues. Like, for example, I try to stay out of things that I don't feel like I have a lot of knowledge about. But all of a sudden, here this comes. And one thing I do have knowledge about is that homes where cannabis is consumed has lower incidences of violence than, for example, alcohol. Like, the cops will talk about it all the time. They don't get called about domestic violence as it relates to getting high. They call about it when usually there's alcohol in the mix. And this is something you can, when you speak with law enforcement about, anecdotally, they will share about that as the number one kind of through line to domestic situations. So just to raise two examples of how these headlines are tying together things that are actually quite far apart. And then raising this thing called scromiting, which I do know somebody who has this condition, and it was from a significant amount of consumption of high potency product over a very, very long time. And she did share with me that she had this experience. That is, of all the people we know in the industry, one person. And by the way, has been slowly able to reintroduce cannabis back into her life in different doses and different form factors. So, I think it's like early days and it's not statistically significant. This notion of scream vomiting, I mean, I was laughing with you that, if I ever get sick to my stomach, I'm crying and screaming the whole way down anyway, because it's such a horrible experience.
I believe that's called cromiting. Just
Exactly.
crying.
Yeah. So, I think if anyone wants to have a good source to this, Dr. Lester Grinspoon is on Twitter, and he's pretty active, and he is the son of one of the pioneers of doing research around cannabis. And so he has a long legacy and a long history. And I believe he's actually met Carl Sagan, who we all know wrote and contemplated about cannabis. But all this goes by the wayside to say that this is a line where the media is almost creating like a de facto ad campaign around cannabis. And it's okay if it's a one-off here or if it's a one-off there, but I'm very mindful of the origins of how reefer madness came about and how we built a incredibly institutional and systematized form of racism around, and, just all kinds of issues around cannabis as a way to actually deflect from other things. Like, we know there was, for example, the logging industry was not interested in hemp being around anymore. And the logging industry had controlling stakes in the media, and same things with pharmaceutical applications of cannabis, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was levered up. And I don't know, have you ever seen the movie Reefer Madness?
Never seen it, no.
I've only seen excerpts of it, and it's funny in as much as it's far away from now, but I don't think we should forget about it, right? Because it still can come back around.
Well, when it came out, was it taken pretty seriously by the mainstream?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And it tied in violence, and it tied in old tropes of fear. And that's what I'm concerned about when I see, it's like one thing if it's, a random data point, but when you start triangulating these tales around cannabis being misused, we have to be careful that it doesn't become woven into a tapestry that's harder to kind of untangle.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's my thought too. It's like we obviously can be quite dismissive of it and frustrated by it, but it just kind of rolls up because we've seen the other data that's out there. We've seen these studies that legalization is a net positive, right? And teen usage is flat, if not down, in legal markets. And, here, this New York Times article specifically focuses on teens, specifically focuses on people that can't purchase in the legal channels, and just make it seem a lot scarier, I think, than the data would show, right? But I'm sure these articles do really well. It's not as exciting to say like, yeah, this industry is pretty safe and fine and boring like everything else, right? But that's not as exciting. It doesn't get the clicks, probably doesn't spread around social media nearly as much. And I mean, that's just the nature of it, right? That's just the nature of us as humans. We kind of lean into that fear of anything. So I see how it happens. But I think the biggest challenge for us as an industry here, is that the hearts and minds of just the mainstream audience that's, getting fed this information. And like, I'm a subscriber to the New York Times, right? I'm not someone who watches Fox News, but I have family that certainly does, like everybody does. And these things are out there, but there's no like good counterpoint, right? Like when, we talk about gun violence, you're going to have one side talking about it one way, which is apparently trying to link it to cannabis. And then you have the other side saying we should have sensible gun control laws. And there's, pretty loud voices in the room on both sides, right? And in our industry, I feel like that is completely missing. You have loud voices on one side coming from multiple channels, no good heavy counterpoint that other people are listening to that's kind of getting into another mainstream audience. The only people that are hearing the counterpoints are us, like that are sitting here in the space. And it's just like not helpful. We're already on side. When you see like the comments on like the Fox News articles that try and link this, the comments are like, yeah, I've consumed cannabis forever and I'm fine. This is crazy. But those people already won. They're already on our team here, right? It's not those people that we need to convince or that can't see through these articles. It's everybody else. And so like, how are we going to fix this?
Yeah. And so I think about other times that I've seen industries step up together to create a narrative around why they should remain relevant, and not just relevant, but potentially beloved. And, I think there's the Milk It Does a Body Good campaign that occurred in the 80s. I think that dairy... Talk about scromiting. If I drank dairy, scromiting all night. But, that's me. But, I think like the dairy industry has come up against a few times where they faced headwinds in terms of popularity of people consuming dairy. And so you had that in the 80s. Then you had the Got Milk campaign in the 90s. And, they were all trying to kind of create these different stories around why it's relevant. And then there was the Milk Mustache campaigns, which was like very sexy and cool and kind of making it relevant again with really good looking people who looked really healthy. And then I was thinking about another time, which is when diets had really gone to the really heavy, like Atkins diet, or I can't remember what some of these other ones were, but they were all about low sugar. And so people were eating like Cool Whip and just eating, meat or actually a lot of dairy. And, they were avoiding fruits and things like that because they were quote unquote high sugar. And so orange juice fell into that category of people avoiding orange juice because it's high sugar. Well, sometimes it is, and it is kind of a high sugar thing. But, I was actually doing consulting work at the time, and I got hired by PepsiCo, which owns Tropicana, and they were trying to figure out how to reposition orange juice as a part of a healthy lifestyle and to reintegrate it back into people's lives so that it wasn't the, kind of the redheaded stepchild that got put out because of this whole aversion to sugar. So, I mean, this is something that does happen to whole industries, to whole commodities, to whole categories, which is really what we are doing here in cannabis. And I think a lot about the talking points of our industry, I think we're pragmatists. We talk a lot about the stocks and why they're undervalued and what we can do to really drive them forward, because look at those fundamentals of EBITDA plus growth year over year, all of these things. But I got to be honest, like that's not the hook. And when you think of these fear tactics, the hook is about emotion. It is about driving into fear. And so to your point, like what is the thing as our industry? What's our Got Milk? What is our Milk Mustache? What can we do that we stand up and we can hook into the emotional resonance of why cannabis is a product category that can remain relevant and actually is beneficial versus other product categories?
Certainly, like that is what we need to do, right? That's what we need to do as an industry, is to come together around something like this. I think the hardest part with that is we're so limited on like marketing channels and like to be able to make a lot of noise about this. And anytime you see a big ad campaign that gets some airtime on something, it's a big win, right? And it's not so easy, but certainly it's got to start somewhere, because like this kind of stuff is going to continue. And, it's top of mind because we're seeing a handful of these things coming through right now, but it's not going to be the last time we see it. And, probably not the last time we talk about it on social media or, roll our eyes at these articles. So the sooner we do that, the better. And I think it really we'll rely on everybody in this space to come together and figure that out.
I think so too. And I always think back to a favorite line I had from Mad Men, from Don Draper, when he used to say, if you don't like what they're saying, change the conversation.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.